Welcome. My name is Sarah Lowenberg, and I am the Manager of Education for the Louisiana State Museum. And I'm excited to be able to welcome you all to our second Thursday lecture of 2021 with Robert Freeland, exploring Cinco de Mayo and the New Orleans connection. Just a quick note that we are recording this event, so we will send you a link to the recording tomorrow, along with a brief survey that we hope you'll fill out to help us continue to grow and improve as we offer virtual programming throughout this coming spring. Also, I see everybody has their cameras off, so if that works, and I may mute you at some point. It's not because we don't want to hear from you, it's simply the way that sound works on Zoom. But at the end of the program, there will be opportunity for questions and answers, and you are welcome to unmute yourself if you prefer to ask your question verbally. And I'll be sure to allow a period of time for those who would like to speak up. Otherwise, we encourage you to drop your questions in the chat throughout the program, and I'll be monitoring those so that we can get to them at the conclusion of the presentation. I want to say a quick thank you to our partner organization, Friends of the Cabildo, for hosting this program and for all that they do to make our programming and their programming possible and to bring these opportunities to us even as we're stuck at home right now, staying safe. Also, I hope you'll join us next month. Our next second Thursday lecture is with author Steve Luxenberg, who will be speaking on his recent book, Separate: The Story of Plessy versus Ferguson and America's Journey from Slavery to Segregation. You can find that information on the website louisianastatemuseum.org, on our events calendar, or on Facebook. It is, however, happening on February 18th. You'll note that that is the third Thursday of February, not the second. We are pushing it back a week simply to avoid the carnival season. Even though it won't look like years past, we expect there will be a lot going on that week. And so with that, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for this evening, Robert Freeland, who is the Vice President of Friends of the Cabildo, the volunteer organization of the Louisiana State Museum. He's a tour guide and the project leader for Friends of the Cabildo's Spanish Heritage Program for Spanish classes. He's an alumnus of Tulane University with a BA in Economics and Latin American Studies. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Bob. We're working on screen sharing.
Okay, so thank you. And I see some old friends here, some new friends. Thank you, Sarah, for setting this up. It's an interesting subject because to us in the United States, Cinco de Mayo is the way most of us know about Mexico. Yet in Mexico, it is one of the dates that they celebrate and not as strong as we do. And I've been told the reason for that is after the Mexican War in the 1840s, many Mexicans became Americans like we did in Louisiana, where we were purchased by the Americans. And so whether we wanted to or not, we were now Americans, no longer French or Spanish. These Mexicans became Americans. And when the Cinco de Mayo occurs in 1862, and that's the story that I'll be telling, Mexicans on this side of the border, it was their way of supporting their original country. And the celebrations became very big on this side. And then Mexican product companies, the tequila makers, the beer makers, the Taco Bells, Mexican restaurants, all really started celebrating Cinco de Mayo. And then in New Orleans, we celebrate it in a different way. And for some of you that aren't from New Orleans, downtown by the river in 2016, there was a collapse of an ancient tunnel, and there was a sinkhole, S-I-N-K HOLE, and all the bars and restaurants in that part of the town. It happened like a week before Cinco de Mayo. They had Cinco de Mayo celebrations. And again, everybody was out there drinking, eating. But today I'm going to tell you the more serious part of this story. So I'm going to talk about Mexican history because Cinco de Mayo is simply one of the dates. And Louisiana was part of Mexico for a long time under the Spanish period. We were part of their history during independence. And you're going to see how this history ties into Louisiana. And still today, Mexico is very important to the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana. I will focus on Benito Juarez himself, arguably Mexico's greatest president, and how the Cinco de Mayo came about. I represent the Friends of the Cabildo. A couple of years ago, we created what we call the Spanish Heritage Program. Our focus is to get to Spanish students in public schools, private schools, universities. We're in our 4th year, and COVID threw us off in 2020. And so what we're hoping for is once COVID is over, we'll be able to go into our 5th year with all the programs at full steam. The program includes lectures. So what you're seeing today is one of the lectures we give to the classes. The kids come down to the French Quarter. We do a French Quarter walking tour. We take them into the museum buildings. And so far, we have 2 very important partners. We have the Spanish Ministry of Education and the New Orleans Mexican Consulate. So Amalia de Arozarena is the employee of the Spanish Ministry of Education housed in Baton Rouge. She works with Spanish teachers in the public school system. So we have access, the Friends has access to all of these teachers. And then the Mexican Consulate, the new consul came in about a year ago, Tito Morales Borello. He's been to some of my presentations with teachers. Recently, another person joined the office, Carlos Raul Suarez, and next week I'll be meeting with him for the 3rd or 4th time on different aspects of the program. And then they also have Maria Albaran, who I started working with 10 years ago for the 200 years of Mexican independence in 2010. And the basis of the program is the statues tell the story. And for you guys that know New Orleans, statues throughout the city, statues in the past couple of years have been a big issue. And that coincides with this program because what we're talking about here is the importance of these statues. And more or less from left to right, Bernardo de Galvez, the 4th Spanish governor, was a hero of the American Revolution. Simon Bolivar is from the liberator of South America. 2 of his admirals were born in New Orleans. Jose de Villamil, who is known as the father of Ecuador's Navy. And more importantly was Renato Belush, who is actually buried next to Bolivar in the Pantheon of Heroes in Latin America, in Caracas, Venezuela. Benito Juarez, Francisco Morazan, a Honduran from Central America, Jose Marti of Cuba. And then I have in there an American named Chet Morrison, and I'll talk about him at the end of the presentation. So the images that you're going to be seeing in the presentation, some are from the Louisiana State Museum, exhibits and different artifacts that we have. The Friends of the Cabildo has helped me put together some of the presentations. And in a way, very important is Tulane's Latin American Library. The librarian there, Hortensia Calvo, is like my mentor. She's helped me put together a lot of the information. Anytime she finds something new, she advises me and I build it into my presentation. And then there's a very small, easy book. It's out of print, Benito Juarez by Dennis Wetman, and great illustrations. And I use these images because some of the kids that we present to are 3rd and 4th graders. And so you'll see the illustrations. And obviously, if I'm doing Tulane grad students, it's a different level. But the presentation you're going to see can be given to a 3rd grader as well as a grad student. Tell you a little bit about the Friends. We are a private nonprofit. We are made up of volunteers. All of this that I'm doing is as a volunteer, so we're always enlisting new volunteers. We have a large member base And 25% of our members are based outside of New Orleans. So if any of you are not from New Orleans, feel free to join the Friends of the Cabildo, and you'll be participating in all of our programs, the virtual ones. And when you visit New Orleans, you can physically visit our buildings. And our buildings are very much a part of Latin American and Spanish history. The Cabildo is the main building. It was built in the Spanish period. The man that paid for it was Andres Almonaster. The architect that designed the Cabildo also designed the presbytere, which actually was completed in the American period, and both of them St. Louis Cathedral on Jackson Square. And flanking Jackson Square itself are the Pontalba apartments, and the Louisiana State Museum has one of the apartments in the St. Anne side, which is actually, all 3 floors are decorated as it would have been in 1850. And what is the Spanish tie-in to that? Micaela Pontalba, the Baroness, is actually the daughter of Andres. So my preference is for people of Spanish origin, so I call her a Spaniard, where most people consider her a French woman. The 4th building is Madame John's Legacy. It was built in 1788 after a fire. It is the site of the birthplace of Renato Belush, that admiral that I mentioned. And then the old US Mint is now known as the New Orleans Jazz Museum. It was built in the American period, but the 3rd floor is where we house the Spanish archives from the Spanish government, the colonial period. So scholars, students can access physically the archives, and we're in the process of finalizing the digitization of those archives. What exhibits do we do at the museum? I'll give you some samples. In 2018, a massive exhibit took over the whole Cabildo. It was from Spain. It was called Recovered Memories, Spain, New Orleans, and the Support for the American Revolution. Right after, with our Canary Islanders, and again, for those that aren't from New Orleans, in St. Bernard Parish, we have Canary Islanders, and around the area of Baton Rouge, Canary Islanders. And these are people that came to Louisiana in the 1770s, 1780s. They've been here ever since. Recently, with the Mexican consulate at the New Orleans Jazz Museum, we had a Dia de los Muertos exhibit. And obviously with COVID, we didn't get the crowds coming in that normally we would have done. But going forward, we'll continue with this program with the Mexican consulate. So let's go to the basic part of the presentation. Louisiana has always been an important part of contact between Mexico and the United States. And these links over time, sometimes they weaken, sometimes they get stronger. The reason for this program that we have at the museum is that they keep on getting stronger. Let's go back to who Spain is. Spain, the country, was founded when Isabel of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon married. And they are the sponsors of Christopher Columbus, who comes to the New World. 2 years later, the Pope, and at that time everybody in Europe was Catholic, divides the world in 2 with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Portugal gets a piece of Brazil, all of Africa, all of Asia, and Spain gets the Americas. When they take us over, this map shows us the Virreinato de Nueva España, or the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And you can see here that Florida and Louisiana at that time are part of this Viceroyalty. Our first Europeans crossing the Mississippi are in this period, 1542, Hernando de Soto. He doesn't find New Orleans, but he does find the Mississippi. Then we become French. As Spain starts losing territory, the French come out of Canada. They go down the Mississippi. De La Salle declares the Mississippi and all of its tributaries for France. France is a Catholic country. The Pope accepts, and we become French. Iberville, the older brother, is the founder of the colony of Louisiana. Bienville, his younger brother, founds the city of New Orleans in 1718. We are a crown colony, disorganized. So the French government doesn't really know what to do with us. They privatize Louisiana by turning it over to Antoine Crozat, who almost goes bankrupt. And then we have an IPO, and it is John Law creates the Company of the West, which results in the Mississippi bubble, and France almost collapses economically. We go back to being a crown colony, and the French really don't know what to do with us. They never make us profitable. And then war occurs. In the United States, we call this war the French-Indian War, and it started in the United States. Worldwide, it is known as the 7 Years' War, and it is considered the first truly world war. And this map shows us in blue the countries that were allied with England, mostly Portugal, and the countries that were against, which are the Bourbon countries of France and Spain. France loses Canada and Louisiana. Spain loses Florida, and France loses Canada to the English. So now the English are really the most powerful in North America. But Spain picks up Louisiana, so we become Spanish for a second time. This is our king when we become Spanish. Charles III is the best of the Bourbon kings. He was our king, and we have named St. Charles Avenue, which is the most important avenue in terms of elegance in New Orleans, after a Spanish king. And I want to show you how New Orleans wasn't a backwater for the Spanish government, but was a very strategically important country. And I'm going to show you this through this family. Bernardo de Galvez, the fourth Spanish governor, is military. In his career began in the military at the age of 15. He's from Malaga in Spain, and he fought in Africa, in Europe, and he made his name fighting Apaches in Mexico, again, New Spain, and he is brought to New Orleans in 1777. His father, Matias, was the governor of the Canary Islands, then of Central America, and he ends his days in the colonial administration as viceroy in New Spain. His brother Jose was the minister of the Indies, reporting direct to Charles III. And so I've taken Gilbert Din's History of the Cabildo. He has a very simple org chart of how the Spanish government worked. And I've inserted the images that we just saw, and you can see how Galvez, Bernardo, reports to Havana, Cuba, who reports to Mexico City, who reports to Madrid, directly to the king. So what this means is anything Bernardo needed, anything that was happening in New Orleans, the information was given to the king very quickly. And that is different than many of the other periods that New Orleans had the French, that really what was going on here wasn't that important. 1779, the United States is at war. France has joined the United States against the British. Spain cannot do so because they have colonies in Latin America. So the Treaty of Aranjuez allies Spain to France against England, but not in open support of the United States. In August of 79, Bernardo receives notification that he is now full governor and that the war has occurred and he should attack the British territories. And again, after the 7 Years' War, the eastern part of the Mississippi, except New Orleans, was part of the Britain. New Orleans was the only part east of the Mississippi that still remained in Spanish hands. So this map that was part of the exhibit, you can see New Orleans down in the middle. Galvez goes upriver. He takes Manchac, the little swords cross there. He takes Baton Rouge. So September 21st in Louisiana is the day we celebrate American independence. Obviously, we celebrate the 4th of July, but September 21st is important as well. And then Galvez takes Mobile, Alabama. He then approaches Pensacola, which again was part of the Virreinato of Nueva España, also reporting into Mexico. And he takes the bay, he enters the bay, he beats the British over a 3-month siege. He is wounded. So this man is actually fighting with his troops in the front lines. And they blow up the British powder magazine on May 8th, and the British surrender. So if you know your American history, George Rogers Clark took Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois in a couple of battles up there. So the upper Mississippi was now in American or Spanish hands. St. Louis was still Spanish. Now with Galvez taking Natchez, Manchac, and Baton Rouge, the Mississippi is in American or Spanish hands. And by taking Mobile and Pensacola, Britain no longer had any access to attack George Washington from behind. They had to focus on the Atlantic seaboard. Galvez is promoted. He is made a count. He participates in the Treaty of Paris, and he is promoted to Governor General in Cuba. This is his coat of arms, and we can see there that the ship that he used to attack the British in Pensacola. And this is the portrait of Galvez at that period. And I like showing this to the kids, you know, especially some of the schools. Kids are, depending on the age, they don't like listening to their parents. Well, this is Galvez. He's a general. He's a governor. He's a count. You see the letter he's holding in his hand? You flip it upside down, and if any of you can read Spanish, it starts out this way. My dear son Bernardo, congratulations for your victories. Don't let them go to your head. After all, you owe your success to your king and to God. And so the message here is this man at the age of 35, 36 is still listening to his father. Galvez goes to Mexico from here. He becomes the viceroy upon the death of his father. He is very well liked there. He consolidates more power than any other viceroy because he worked with the church to complete Mexico City's cathedral. He combated a famine, so the poor people loved him because he fed them. And then he did some symbolic construction, including the Castillo de Chapultepec. And can you imagine, he dies after 18 months after doing all of this. He wasn't even 40 years old. His wife, Marie Félicité Saint-Maxime d'Estrahan, was a lady from New Orleans. They had 3 kids, and unfortunately, none of the children had children. So there are no direct descendants of Galvez left. Statue of him in New Orleans. And so this is the backstory to the Galvez statue. It was placed at the foot of Canal Street in 1977 by the Spanish government. Charles III dies, and his ineffective son, Charles IV, becomes king. He is weak. He lets Napoleon succor him into giving Louisiana to Napoleon, whereby Napoleon turns around and sells it to the Americans. And we know that in our Louisiana history as the Louisiana Purchase. So we are no longer part of Mexico in this period. But if you look at the map, we are neighbors with Mexico, what is left. This image, I love it. It's part of the Tulane Latin American Library Archives. It is from an ad in magazines that are about 110 years ago, were published here in New Orleans. And what you have there is Uncle Sam, and the mouth is reaching out to Latin America. And that's how powerful New Orleans was still as an economy in 1910, 1915, and the importance we had with Latin America and Mexico. And what was happening in Latin America once we become American? The United States became independent in 1776. France in 1789 had their revolution. Haiti, the Haitian slaves expel the whites and free people, and they take over the island. And so these are models for Latin America to follow. And then the Napoleonic invasions occur. What happens here is Napoleon forces the 2 kings, Charles IV, who we already mentioned, and his son, Ferdinand VII, to abdicate. What he does, he puts his son, his brother, Joseph, as king of Spain. The two kings are not executed or anything, they're in jail, but there is a government in hiding that is still communicating with the New World, and they receive instructions to rebel against Joseph, not against Spain, but against King Joseph. In New Orleans at the time, this painting is of Père Antoine, probably the greatest of the priests that ever served St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter. He was Spanish in origin, even though his name locally is Père Antoine, a Frenchman. And he kept an eye on things for the Spanish government. So he was more or less, you could call him a spy. At a time where 50% of the ships arriving in New Orleans were actually coming in from Latin America. There was a cabildo in Baton Rouge, That part of Spain was called West Florida, which went from Baton Rouge to Pensacola, and then East Florida went from Pensacola all the way down to Miami, with their capital being St. Augustine. They took the order or the liberty of declaring themselves independent of Spain on September 23rd, 1810. And a couple of months later, the United States absorbed this new country. 1813, the United States consolidated the acquiring of Florida by taking Mobile in Alabama and East Florida in 1821. So what the United States government did was it gave Mobile to Alabama, allowing it to have shoreline, and it gave Gulfport and Biloxi, that part of Mississippi. So Mississippi now has shoreline, and the interior parishes, counties, were given to Louisiana, and we call them the Florida parishes. So those parishes are actually east of the Mississippi, as is New Orleans. Everything else in the state is west of the Mississippi. Back to Mexico. September 16th, the Grito de Dolores by Padre Miguel Hidalgo declares Mexico independent. Now, this is like our 4th of July. We declare ourselves independent, but then we go to war. I'm comparing the Mexican Revolution, independence movement during these presentations to what was going on in South America and elsewhere. So in that comparison, Mexico's war of independence was more class against class when you compare it to South America, which was more the rich wanted to be independent, but they still wanted to control the country. It was the bloodiest of the independence wars. And you can divide from a military perspective, the Mexican independence into two periods. From 1810 to 1814, the insurgents had large armies. And then from 1814 to 1820, small actions were successful. And so finally, in 1821, Agustin de Iturbide, who was a pure white, if you will, Spanish origin general, and Vicente Guerrero, who had Native American blood as well as African blood, as well as white blood, these two generals met and they said, we will work together to finally kick out the Spaniards. And Mexico, then the consolidation is on September 27th. And what they call it, and is in Spanish, for you guys that understand Spanish, the date is the consummation of independence. So this would be more or less the equivalent of our Treaty of Paris, which resulted in the Articles of Confederation. And later in the year, this date will be celebrated by the Mexican consulate, and we, the Friends of the Cabildo, will incorporate this information into our training programs. Let's go back to New Orleans. How many of you have heard of the Lafitte's, Jean and Pierre? Well, most people have, especially if you come to New Orleans often. And if I ask you what were they, most people will say, as these books, pirate. And what I have here is a progression. In the 1930s, the first biography, Lyle Saxon, writes and calls them the pirates, the pirate Lafitte. About 30 years later, Robert Talon upgrades the pirates, still calls him the pirate Lafitte, but he mentions the Battle of New Orleans. And then in 2005, the definitive biography is written by William Davis, who not only uses English sources, he understands Spanish, speaks Spanish, he researches the true story behind these heroes of Latin American independence. So in the Louisiana State Museum, the second floor of the Cabildo, we have an exhibit to the Battle of New Orleans. This is the bust of Renato Beluche. If you look carefully, he is not in a pirate's uniform. He is in an admiral's uniform because he did serve the government of Gran Colombia. And these images here to the left is Louis Aury, who was a Frenchman, who was in charge of letters of marque in commissions. And he served Simon Bolivar. Bolivar and Aury fought. Aury leaves this South America and he goes to Mexico and he serves Mexico. gets kicked out of Mexico by the Spanish, and he ends up dying in Panama by falling off his horse. And the reason I'm talking about Auri, this is a commission. And so consider yourself the American government. Your ally is Spain. Any enemy of Spain is your enemy. You have not recognized the independence of Latin America yet. And so I'm going to read it out and translate. Luis Auri, Commander-in-Chief of the Republican Land and Sea Forces, is authorized by the United States of Buenos Aires in Chile to issue letters of marque and commissions in the area of Nueva Granada. So as an American, I couldn't accept these documents. They were documents of rebels. If I'm from Latin America, I read this, I consider the Lafitte's and Renato Belush heroes of Latin America. Lafitte is kicked out. So if you know your American history, Commander Patterson, the US naval officer, kicks him out of Barataria. And then they say in American history that Lafitte had to go to Galveston and he set up his pirate operations in Galveston. But Lafitte in Galveston was fighting under Francisco Javier Mina, the general of Mexico at the time, and with Auri. When Patterson, at the request of Spain, destroys Galveston, Lafitte, Auri, and Mina leave. Mina is captured by the Spanish, he is executed, and as I said before, Auri dies. What does Lafitte do? He goes to Colombia, but before that, this book, if you're interested in the true story of Lafitte, is the naval history of Mexican independence. And what you have here is a small chapter on Jean and Pierre Lafitte and the theaters in the Mexican independence that they fought. So I hope you all understand that the Lafittes are not pirates. They are actually heroes of Latin American independence. And after Mexico, Lafitte is forced to go to Gran Colombia. He becomes a privateer on an official, so he's not a naval officer, he is a privateer on a Colombian ship, and he dies at sea off the coast of Honduras, trying to defeat the Spanish. The Mexican go back to Mexico. Now Mexico is independent. The United States recognizes Mexico. Their first consulate in 1822 was actually in New Orleans. Unfortunately, as New Orleans collapsed economically, it was closed in 2002. And then in 2008, George Bush and Felipe Calderon, president of Mexico, reopened the consulate. And that is the entity that is now working with the Friends of the Cabildo and the Louisiana State Museum on things like we saw Dia de los Muertos, etc. And their projects will become part of the Statues Tell the Story. The Lizardi, you all know the lower Ninth Ward, Lizardi and Forstall are two streets. The Lizardis were very wealthy Mexicans that were loyal to Spain. They left Mexico. They came to New Orleans, and that's the HNOC, the Historic New Orleans Collection. That's where they lived. And Spain and Mexico did not recognize each other. So obviously importation, exportation was prohibited. The Lizardis became super wealthy, receiving merchandise from Spain here in New Orleans, selling it to Mexico as American goods, receiving goods from Mexico, importing it to New Orleans, and then selling it to the Spanish as American goods. Once Spain and Mexico reconnected, then obviously the Lizardi fortune had to move around, but in the meantime, they became very wealthy here in New Orleans. In the 1850s, there was a plan, once the California Gold Rush, to connect New Orleans to San Francisco via what is known as the Tehuantepec route. And John Slidell was a Louisiana congressman, was one of the main negotiators with Mexico and trying to get the US Congress to approve it. Northern congressmen did not want this route to develop that way because they knew the Civil War was coming and they feared that it would give an advantage to the South. Speaking of railroads, when I say Underground Railroad during slave times, what image comes to your minds? not this one. And there's some arrows missing from here, and that would be from New Orleans outbound on ships. We know that there are abolitionist owners of ships, ship's captains, that took American slaves up to the Northeast. But we also know from Cuban history that there were, even though Cuba still had, was part of Spain, still had slavery, there were abolitionists that would receive the American slaves and declare them free in Cuba. And Mexico did the same thing. This map is by land over Texas, but Texas was part of the South. They really weren't letting that many slaves go through. So many of the American slaves that fled ended up in Veracruz, Mexico, but now they are considered Afro-Mexicans. They've lost their connections to New Orleans. So again, now this part is New Orleans in the 1840s and 50s. The first Spanish newspaper in the United States was El Mississippi, issued in 1808. Major French newspapers in New Orleans had sections in Spanish. And then as turmoil occurs in Central America and Mexico, especially Mexico, we even had the case in 1844 of the Diario del Gobierno de la República Mexicana was exiled. They brought their printing presses to New Orleans and they published their Mexican newspaper from New Orleans. And before the Civil War, we had almost twice the number of newspapers at New York, the second most important city for speaking Spanish in the United States at the time. Other exiles based in New Orleans, and down there we have the statue of Jose Marti. He himself never made it here, but he was part of Cuban history, following in the footsteps of this man, Narciso Lopez, who used New Orleans as his base of operations to try to take Cuba from the Spanish. These photos are Poydras Street by the Hell Boggs Courthouse. Over here to the upper left hand, you'll see the memorial. And I'll read the plaques if you guys can't see it. The first one is the Cuban flag was first flown in 1850 from this site, the home of the Daily Delta, 52 years before Cuba actually became an independent republic. And the Lions Club of Cuba is the one that created this memorial. And down below in this 1976, the Lions Club out of Miami is the one that paid for the second plaque. And so there are people that walk by this memorial every day of their lives and they don't even realize the importance to Latin American history. Central America broke apart. It left Mexico, declared itself independent, became very disorganized, and it allowed this man, William Walker, in 1849, his wife had died. She was from New Orleans. He became very despondent, and he was a Southerner. And his strategy was, I take these countries and I vote them into the United States, and they become pro-slavery. He became president of Nicaragua for 4 years, was unable to hold it. He comes back to New Orleans, and the English did not like him because he'd fought with the English who were trying to control that part of Central America. It's no longer Spanish, no longer Mexican. He fought with Cornelius Vanderbilt. So what they did was the British captured him, turned him over to Honduras, and he is executed. And that is part of the story that we use to talk about Morazan, who was a Honduran, and our largest Hispanic community in New Orleans are the Hondurans. Let's go back to Mexico. Very disorganized. In those 56 years, there were enough emperors and dictators and presidents to create a new government, basically on average every 9 months. And then they start losing territory. They lost Central America right away in 1822. The Americans take Texas in the 1830s, early 1840s. New Orleans participated in this because our newspapers and our businessmen really publicized the fact that Texas should be American and not Mexican. And just for you guys, there are people from the Mexican consulate on the call. I told them that when I went through this section of the presentation, I would be very diplomatic in how I presented to the group. Then we had the Mexican War in 1846 to 1848. And this Baton Rouge at the time is the largest, the Jackson Barracks in downtown Baton Rouge is the largest military based the United States as in what was known as the Western United States. New Orleans in this period was the fourth largest city, the second largest port, and many troops did attack Mexico from Texas, but a large percent came through the city of New Orleans. So New Orleans would have been paying attention to what the Mexicans were doing, what the Central Americans were doing, and what the Americans were doing. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a local, was a hero in the Mexican War. To simplify what was going on in Mexico, you had the equivalent of two parties, the liberals or the conservatives. Santa Anna of Alamo fame was a conservative. They wanted traditional power and a strong church. And then probably, I like him the most, Melchor Ocampo was a liberal. And what he's fighting for is individual political and economic freedom. What do these men have in common? This list is important people in Mexican history. You have presidents, vice presidents, ministers, governors of states. They all lived in New Orleans, exiled by Santa Anna or some other government. And they lived here with this man that is the focus of our presentation, Benito Juarez. He was born in 1806 in Oaxaca. He is a Zapotec Indian, very educated. He worked for bookbinders. He studied university, very good family man. He had 12 kids. These are images of his family. And he becomes a lawyer. He becomes a city councilman. He gets elected to Congress. He becomes a judge. And then in 1847, governor of Oaxaca. He is exiled by Santa Anna to New Orleans. This image hangs in it used to hang in the Mexican consulate in New York City. I don't know where it is now. And the way I describe this, especially the kids, is this man was a governor. He could have pillaged the treasury of Oaxaca. He did not. He came here, poor man. He was humble enough, even with all of his importance, that he worked in the French market, rolling cigars and selling fish. And that's what this image shows, is Benito Juarez during his stay here in New Orleans. And very little is known about his thoughts of New Orleans. We do know that because he was dark-skinned, he was not considered white, he was not a slave, he was that middle category that we had in New Orleans, the free people of color. Most of them that we saw earlier, they returned to Mexico and they declare the Plan de Ayutla, desconociendo a Santa Anna. And what they do is they kick Santa Anna and the conservatives out of power. Benito now is made minister of the Supreme Court of Justice. And Mexican law at the time, when the president steps down, it is the minister of the Supreme Court that becomes the president. So he becomes an interim president, and he finally is elected in 1861, coinciding with Lincoln. Benito is famous for the implementation of the Ley Juarez, the Ley de Reforma, and what they do is basically freedoms of speech, religion, education, assembly now become, like our Bill of Rights in the United States, available to all Mexican citizens. The conservatives do not like this. They almost execute him. Benito flees. He makes it to Panama, Cuba, comes through New Orleans a second time, and he gets in trouble because some of the conservatives claim that once he left the country, he should have conceded the presidency. The conservatives incurred debts to Spain, England, and France. Juarez cannot receive support from the United States, which by 1861, the Civil War had already begun. The three countries pressure Juarez. Spain and England settle the debts, but France, through Napoleon III, continues. And he, the conservatives in the church, create a monarchy, and they choose Maximilian, a Habsburg, not too wise, not too smart to be the Emperor of Mexico. 1862, the Europeans attack Mexico, they take Veracruz, and on the 5th of May in Puebla, Mexico. So if you look at a map, you have Veracruz on the coastline, Puebla in between, and right after Puebla, you have Mexico City. He beats the French this time, and it delays the final invasion. In the final invasion, the French actually take Puebla and Mexico City. Now, I call it the chess game. If you don't take the king, you haven't won the game. And Juarez, through this map, you can see He kept on fleeing the French and the conservatives. They never took him, therefore they never defeated Wadi's presidency. France finally gives up in 1867. By this time, the United States is a little bit stronger. They're sort of upset with France for having sided or almost sided with the Confederates. And Maximilian is tried and executed in 1867. Benito Juarez is reelected in 1871. And unfortunately for history, he dies of a heart attack in 1872. And as we can see from these images, he's very important in as an icon of everybody Mexican. And he is famous for a slogan. And I'm going to read it in English, and there's two English versions here. Respect for the right of others is peace. And the other side, the left side, is a little bit more complete. Amongst individuals as amongst nations, peace is the respect of others' rights. And he's very famous. And in this upper image, you see him alongside Lincoln and Simón Bolívar. In New Orleans, we have a statue. It was originally erected in 1965. It is located on Basin Street. Victor Skiro was our mayor. And in 1972, additional plaques were placed under Moon Landrieu's administration. An important date to remember, and we tell the kids this in the program, March 21st is Benito's birth date. Look at the plaque a little bit closer. You can see that it was dedicated by the Landrieu administration and the Mexican government. We tried to have, Tito Morel, who is the Mexican consul, tried to have Tito Morales tried to have an event March 21st last year, but COVID hit us. So this year we'll probably have COVID March 21st, but keep an eye on that statue because we're going to see a lot of things happening around it. So politically, things are over with New Orleans. In 1884, we have a World's Fair in New Orleans. Our trade is very strong with Central and Latin America. And the Mexicans put a pavilion at the Continental Exposition, which apparently was the most visited pavilion in the whole world, the whole World's Fair, because of this aspect of Mexican culture. Military brass bands were part of the presentation. Some of these musicians remained in New Orleans. So remember, jazz is born in 1895. This is pre-jazz. It's after, more or less in the period of ragtime. And the way the Mexicans played instruments like the sax, like the clarinet, is very unique, and the New Orleanians loved it. If you want more information on this, go to Tulane's Hogan Jazz Archives and key in search Mexico, and a series of articles will appear on the contribution of Mexican musicians. The National Park has an exhibit, and it is a quote from Jelly Roll Morton, who is amongst the founders of jazz. And what he says, he calls it the Spanish tinge. Now, what he's referring to isn't Spain, the country, but people that spoke Spanish. There were Mexicans, there were Panamanians, there were Colombians and Cubans that all were here at the birth of jazz. There are, so this next section, teachers in the public school, primary schools, have asked us to focus not only on history, but culture and art. And so here we talk about Francisco Vargas, and the Louisiana State Museum is the owner of some of his beeswax sculptures. He moves to New Orleans. He does a lot of these works with Native American, African Americans, the way they worked manually in the city. And the Louisiana State Museum's images aren't in permanent exhibit. They're behind the scenes right now. A couple of years ago, we did something called Hidden Treasures, and people could see them. But if you're interested in seeing this artwork, go to the Baton Rouge's Rural Life Museum, and they have a whole panel displaying actually about 3 or 4 times what the Louisiana State Museum has. Another famous artist that many of you know about, but not know his name, Enrique Alferez was from Zacatecas, and he lived here until 20 years ago. And he has statues throughout the city. Some of them are in City Park. And so every time you go to City Park by the Botanical Garden, basically you're going by Mexican sculptures. And the reverse also occurred. William Spratling was an American affiliated with Auburn and Tulane. And he goes to Mexico and remained there for a long time. When he leaves here, he sublets his apartment to William Faulkner. So the William Faulkner house in the French Quarter is where Spratling lived. And about 2 years ago, Tulane's Latin American Library was able to acquire all of his archives, and they're now part of Tulane's archives. There was a lady from Baton Rouge, also an artist, Carolyn Duriot. She moved to Mexico with her husband, and they say that Mexican art impacted her art, and she also was important in the art scene in Mexico. Tabasco, there is the most important interchange between the two. In Mexico, they know Tabasco is a state. The rest of the world knows that Tabasco is a Louisiana pepper sauce. And if you read the history of Tabasco, the company and the pepper, it was peppers from Mexico that they used. This mayor, to me, was the greatest mayor New Orleans ever had. 4 times mayor, 15 years in power. He was a general in the Army Reserve. He was president of the Mayor's Association. He would go on trade delegations to Latin America with as much as 45, 60 people. And he traveled almost 60 times to Latin America in those 15 years. He resigns as mayor of New Orleans, becomes John F. Kennedy's ambassador to the OAS, resigns from the OAS to become candidate for governor in March of '64. He loses the election. And 2 months later, unfortunately for New Orleans, he dies in Mexico on a business trip. We lost a great connection there. The statue is the obelisk in front of City Hall. And the other image is Time magazine in the 50s, had him surrounded by all the flags of Latin America because of his importance. And you know, Mérida, Mexico is a sister city of New Orleans. We're talking here about Mexican relations. We should build that relation like you wouldn't believe. And if any of you remember, about 10 years ago, Ray Nagin went to Mérida and the press crucified him for traveling. So instead of building him up and congratulating him for traveling to Mexico and strengthening relations, they chew him out, unlike, can you imagine Chet Morrison, how he would have handled that? And the Louisiana Economic Development is right now, as we talk, preparing for a future trip to Mexico, because Mexico is Louisiana's largest export partner. And so we have to maintain that relation. They buy our goods, they send us goods. And so Mexico is very strong. If you're interested in more information on this, a friend of mine, Annie Gibson, is a Tulane professor, and she and 3 others wrote a book called Hispanic and Latino New Orleans. And New Orleans is different. If you go to California, I'm going to simplify, everybody's Mexican. If you go to New York City, everybody's Puerto Rican. If you go to Miami, everybody's Cuban. But New Orleans has different groups that came at different times. And so you can't simplify the Hispanic culture of New Orleans, because you have to figure out when they arrived here and what group they are participants in. And Annie's book really breaks down the history and the population movements from the beginning of their arrival in New Orleans to the present. So the Spanish Heritage Program, now that you've seen what we talk about, what we show the kids, 2021, regardless of COVID, but obviously when COVID is eliminated, this is what we'll be doing. We have relations, partnerships with Mexico and Spain. We would love to have more commercial groups helping us develop teacher training sessions over the summer. And here I have to thank Sarah Lowenberg, who introduced us, and Eileen Tomzek, who works for her. They've been with the museum less than 3 years. What they have done in the 3 years is really create a first-class education department. And so now we and the friends, we can go to the schools, we can rely back on the museum, but we do still need help in improving the materials that we're going to distribute to the schools. And definitely, because we're a volunteer organization, we need more volunteers to help us with field trips and museum visits. So if any of you on this call are interested or know someone that's interested, please have them contact the Friends of the Cabildo office and we'll work it out. So the last thing I want to say is all of you now, I hope you're inspired to go visit Mexico. And when you go to Mexico City, you have to visit the Iglesia San Fernando. And when they ask you, why do you want to go there? Your answer is, I'm from New Orleans or Louisiana, and I want to see the burial sites of two of the greatest men that ever lived in New Orleans, Ricardo de Galvez and Benito Juarez. And incredibly, both of them are buried in the same complex. Muchas gracias. And I hope you have a great Cinco de Mayo this year and you'll be able to tell all of your friends what you're actually celebrating. Buenas noches.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible wealth of information. Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions and would like to ask them in the chat, feel free to do so at any time. You're also welcome to speak up as we move through the questions as well. We have one quick question in the chat to get us started, which is, what neighborhood is Iglesia San Fernando in?
You know what? I've been about 25 times to Mexico City. I never went there because I used to go when I was working before I retired. I never realized the importance of that. So I really can't tell you. Maybe someone on the call is from Mexico City. They can tell me. Does anybody going once, I really don't know. I should know. And you know what? Mexico City is 20 million population. So there's so many neighborhoods there, but it's got to be somewhere central. Doesn't matter. If you're from New Orleans, you have to go there anyway.
Okay, I respect that. So I'll kick us off with another question, which I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit more about some of the stories behind the statues and how they were erected, some of the motivation, like you mentioned that the Juarez statue went up in 1965. What was the inspiration or motivation behind that?
Okay. Chet Morrison understood our connections to Latin America. He started the International Trade Center. International flights were made. In fact, just in 1946, when he became mayor, he was just retired from the U.S. military. He'd been a colonel. He'd been mayor of Bremen, military governor of Bremen. And the people that complained said to work for him, you either had to be a colonel or speak Spanish. And he had he won his election like in January, but back then it took him 4 months to actually take over. And there was a businessman, owner of stockholder in Hibernia and owner of Delta Steamship Lines. And he told Shep, you have to go to Latin America. The old regulars and the Huey Long machine have forgotten Latin America. You as mayor, you have to reconnect. And so he took trips through Latin America as a mayor in waiting. And when he came back, he says, I have to build up the business with Latin America. So when he got the first statue, it was the Bolivar statue. He placed it on Canal and Basin Street. Now go back in time. That is where the trains used to come in. Canal Street was at its heyday. So it was a very visible statue. Victor Skiro apparently had lived in Honduras as a boy. So he followed up with the Juarez statue and then the Francisco Morazan statue. And they called that Avenue of the Americas. We have forgotten that as a city. And if you go to, if you look at the Times-Picayune a couple of years ago when the Confederate statues were being torn down, someone wrote in and said, why do we have these statues of South Americans? And I answered, they never published my letter, but that's the backstory behind those statues. The Cubans wanted the statue of Jose Marti that was placed in the 90s to go on Basin Street. But if you know Basin Street, they have the obelisk to the Vietnamese community. So that space was given to the Vietnamese, and they put the Jose Marti statue on, what's the new name? Norman Francis. I don't know if it's Boulevard. They just changed the name. So that's where the Jose Marti statue is. The Galvez statue was placed right after American Bicentennial in 1977. And you had a lot of support from the Canary Islanders, these Isleños de Saint Bernard, in the placement of that statue. So those are the 5 statues of Latin Americans. And then obviously Chet Morrison isn't a Latin American. Did I answer the question on the statues?
Yes, I think so. And I do see
Okay,
we have one
okay.
person with their hand raised, but we also have a question in the chat. So Nancy, I see your hand raised, but first I'll ask, how can we connect the current US immigration policies, such as the supposed need for a wall, and this wonderful history that you've just added to our intellectual reservoirs, asks Pamela.
Okay, so that's a tough one. And I have my own opinion, and I have actuality. And again, if you want to read a little bit more, go to Annie Gibson's Hispanic and Latino New Orleans, and they address some of those issues. But here's the way I say it, and I'm going to make a statement. I tend to vote Republican, but I got very upset with Bobby Jindal, because what Bobby Jindal did, he never traveled to Latin America. He went once to China. I follow where our governors and mayors go. I criticize them for not traveling more. And he went to where? He went to Texas to make sure that Rick Perry was building a wall. What Bobby Jindal could have done is, like Louisiana Economic Development Corporation is doing, go to Mexico, build up the business. And that way, everybody gets richer on both sides of the border. The questions you ask about, I guess the farther you are from New Orleans, the more anti-immigrant we are. The closer you get to Orleans Parish, the more liberal we are, and that's the state of Louisiana. And I don't know if I answered the person's question. That was very personal response, not really. And then obviously, Trump tried to build the wall. That upsets Mexicans. That's a whole different. And if we can go into, if you want to go into jokes and cartoons, that's about 10 minutes of laughter.
You're right. It is a fraught question, but I think you addressed it well, thinking about this continued economic partnership between our city and Mexico, and how that could inform us moving forward. And we also got an answer in the comments that the Iglesia de San Fernando is in downtown, the Centro Histórico in Mexico City.
Perfect.
Thank you for that answer. And I think we lost a person whose hand was raised and they had to duck out. But I'm wondering also if you can tell us a little bit more. You alluded to an event that was supposed to have happened this past March around the statue and other things to come. Is there anything more you can tell us about exciting things coming down the pike?
Yes, and thanks for asking that. Carlos Raul Suarez, who is the cultural attaché, authorized me to give the dates in order. 14th of February is the 190 years of the death of Vicente Guerrero, the third Mexican president. 24th of February is the 200 years of the Plan de Iguala. The 21st of March, I put this in, Carlos Raul, I apologize, the birthday of Benito Juarez. The 5th of May, obviously, that's what I'm adding in there, is Cinco de Mayo. The 13th of May, and this was super interesting, is the 700 years of the founding of Mexico City, way back in the Aztec period. 13th of August, the 500 years of the arrival of the Spanish to the city, to Mexico. 15th, 16th of September, as always, is their 15th of September is their independence. The 27th of September is the 200 years of the consolidation of the independence. The 28th of September is the apology to what we call Native Americans, original first Americans. They call them pueblos originarios. So they will be talking about those aspects. And then September 30th is the anniversary of Morelos' birth. Morelos was the second of the great insurgent leaders. If you're interested in reading, and part of, I have to figure out, AMLO is the president of Mexico, Antonio López Obrador, and he is focusing on Native Americans, Native Mexicans, Afro-Mexicans. And so a lot of these dates are there, and I have included them. A lot of in my presentations, if you're interested in this aspect of Latin American history, Gates, who is the Harvard professor, he traveled through Latin America, and he wrote a book, which is his personal perception of Afro history in each one of these countries. And he is amazed. So in his book, I'm sort of paraphrasing, he's amazed that Morelos had African blood. Vicente Guerrero had African blood. And here in the United States, really none of our founding fathers had African blood, but in Mexico, it is very different. So since a lot of the school groups that we do the program with are public schools, which in many cases are mostly African Americans, I have built African history into the presentations. And so these men are important in that regard. So those are the dates that we'll be seeing the Mexican consulate. And again, the next meeting I have with Carlos Raul is to put those into the Spanish Heritage Program for the kids.
Wow, thank you. That's so many exciting things. And just, I think, demonstrates how deep these connections are, that there's so many things to connect with.
Can I say one just
yeah.
Poverty Point in Louisiana, very few people have visited there. It's pyramids from 3,500 years ago. It's up on the Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana border. There are, so 3,500 years ago, King Tut was the pharaoh. Stonehenge was only 500 years old. There are archaeologists that think there is Olmec influence. And the Olmecs developed their civilization at that time in southern Mexico. And there are things in the pyramids that are similar to the Olmecs. And so not all archaeologists, because the Native Americans nowhere in the Americas really had a written language. We don't know, but it could be that our connections with Mexico go back to 3,500 years ago.
Wow, that's incredible. I have one more question, but as promised, I do want to give a pause in case anyone would like to unmute and ask a question verbally. So I'll just give a few seconds for that.
Nothing?
Okay, that's cool too. So I'm curious, since you alluded to, or you mentioned Annie Gibson's book and all of this incredible variety of resources that you've gathered in your research and as you're developing these presentations, but do you have any suggestions for places that people can start looking for more resources if they're interested in learning more about Mexican and Hispanic history and culture in New Orleans?
The answer is yes, and let's go in simple to, if you don't mind, simple to let's take that someone's on this call that now has free time to read. The best book on Louisiana history is Beautiful Crescent. It's very simply written. The original version, the first paragraph in the Spanish period was, New Orleans was never Spanish and there never was a Spanish newspaper in the city of New Orleans. And obviously, through the Tulane's research with that 2008, 2009 exhibit, we were able to get Pelican Publishing at the time to change that section of, we put all of this information in my presentation. So it's a fairly good overview of that, and it's an easy book to read. If you want more depth, Larry Powell's Accidental City, he talks about the French period and the Spanish period. If you're really interested in the Spanish, just skip over the French part and go into the Spanish part. And what he does is he takes what was going on in Mexico, which was our headquarters, and that's what we had to abide by here, and he compares it to the French and the Americans. So it actually, even if you know your Latin American history, standalone information, Larry Powell's book compares it, and it gives you a much better feel. Annie Gibson's and her co-authors, that book is easy to read. It's present day. And then if you're going to read Galvez, to me, the best book is Cowie. It was written in 1935. It is Bernardo de Galvez in Louisiana. Simon Bolivar, if you're going to go into that period, there's an out-of-print book on Renato Belush, the man that fought with Bolivar, Jackson, and Lafitte. Benito Juarez, I read in Spanish, so a lot of the reading I did was in Spanish. If you can get that Wepler book in English, my copy is actually in Portuguese. Central America, that one's a little bit tougher, but a good book to read modern Central America is The Fish That Swallowed the Whale. Can't remember the name of the author, but it talks about how Sam Zamuri, through the banana business, really made New Orleans an important port. And a lot of so the Stone Center of Tulane University is, a lot of that money came from the Zamuri family. He did a lot for the city of New Orleans. And that would be that statue. Jose Marti, go to YouTube, listen to Pete Seeger's version of a song called Guantanamera. And it is fantastic. And Pete Seeger has this voice that is really great. And he sings the song in Spanish, but he tells you the story of Jose Marti in English. And when you know the song and you know the history, every time I listen to it, you get goosebumps. It's such a, and Cubans, that is their greatest hero. He was a fantastic man. He was a poet. And so that covers the statues. There is a book that's out of print on Chet Morrison, and it's called Latin American Mission. And it was an autobiography that he was working on, that when he died, he had completed enough of it that it was actually published. And that gives you his vision for, and you know, one thing, he was just, I love the guy. He was, he worked in the elections. You know, we've been talking about electoral fraud these past couple of weeks. And he would, he was, how do you call it? He worked at the precinct, and he would stay all night because the corruption at that time, everything was paper. They would come in and they would bring the urns with the votes they wanted, steal chips and take it out. So he remained there. The second time he was a lieutenant in the military. He went dressed in his military uniform, and it upset the corrupt regulars and long guys, because they said he was intimidating the people. But what he was actually doing was protecting the people to be able to come in and vote the way they wanted. And he becomes a congressman for the state of Louisiana. And the first thing he does is he votes electronic ballots so that they can't steal the vote. So that's a great, because most people read Long and they like Huey Long. Chet Morrison hated Huey Long. So if you're anti-Long, that's the best book to understand.
Thank you. It's a great anecdote as well. One last second for anybody who has a last minute question before we wrap up. But as we are wrapping up, I just want to say thank you so much, Bob. This has been an incredible presentation filled with so much information. And I know I'm personally excited to dig deeper and learn more, and to see what comes of these next steps with the program. So thank you all for attending and for your questions.
But I have a question.
Yes.
I was asked by some people that I sent my invitation, can they access this presentation after the fact?
Yes.
And you mentioned that it was recorded.
Yes. Anyone that registered in advance will automatically get a link to the recording, and I'll certainly send it to you as well if you'd like to share it with anyone who's not yet on the list. And then eventually, it will also live on our website, louisianastatemuseum.org, under the education and then adults page. We have our recordings of our past public programs there, if anybody would like to check those out. And on that note, I hope that you all are able to join us next month on February 18th. You can find that information on our website as well. And thank you so much for attending. This has been wonderful.
Thanks a lot, guys.
And thank you,
Hang
Bob.
up.
Yeah, all right. I'm going to go ahead and end the event. It's been great to see you all here tonight.
Thanks.
Thank you.